She looked him in the eyes and said 5 words that sealed her fate. "I'm done with you." Hours later, 44-year-old Stacy Feldman would be found dead in her shower, her body bearing over 80 brutal injuries. What her husband claimed was a tragic accident would take 7 agonizing years to expose as cold-blooded murder. This is the story of how one phone call, one brave woman's email, and one sister's unbreakable determination brought a killer to justice. But before we dive into this haunting case, I need you to do something for me. If you're captivated by true crime stories like this one, hit that subscribe button right now. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode from Cold Crime Cases. And here's my question for you. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. I love seeing our community spread across the globe, all united by our search for truth and justice. Now, let's get into this devastating story. Stacy Altman was born to be a mother. Growing up as the youngest of 3 sisters in Muncie, Indiana, she radiated warmth and compassion from her earliest days. Her sister Susan would later describe her as Daddy's little girl, someone who lit up every room she entered. Stacy lived for the color pink, thrived at the center of every celebration, and possessed an unshakable dedication to helping others. But as Stacy moved through her 30s, watching friend after friend walk down the aisle and cradle newborns in their arms, her own dream of marriage and motherhood remained frustratingly out of reach. The biological clock wasn't just ticking, it was thundering. For a woman whose entire identity centered on family and nurturing others, each passing year felt like another door closing. Then Robert Feldman entered her life. Friends called him Bob. He was charismatic, successful, and 14 years older than Stacy. To a woman desperate for partnership and family, he seemed like the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. He was charismatic, you know. He made his way into her heart, friend Jan Goldenberg would later recall. They married around 2005 inches, an extravagant ceremony at the Ritz in Montreal, Canada. Stacy wore a tiara on her wedding day because she genuinely believed she'd found her fairy tale ending. Soon after, they settled into a beautiful home in the Denver suburbs, and Stacy's dreams finally materialized. A daughter arrived first, then a son. The family portrait looked perfect. Stacy threw herself into motherhood with characteristic passion. She became president of the parent-teacher organization at Southmore Elementary School. She volunteered for Partners Seeking a Cure, a nonprofit funding liver disease research. To everyone who knew the Feldmans, they appeared to have it all. The beautiful home, the adorable children, the involved mother, the successful father. But perfection was merely a mask hiding something sinister underneath. Behind closed doors, Bob Feldman revealed himself to be something far darker than the charming husband he portrayed to the world. He was a chronically underperforming salesman, barely bringing in enough income to support his family's lifestyle. This forced Stacy, who had dreamed of staying home with her children, to work outside the home just to keep their household afloat. Worse still was Bob's obsession with control. Every asset existed solely in his name. The house, Bob's name. Every credit card, Bob's name. Stacy had no financial independence whatsoever, and Bob wielded this power like a weapon, constantly reminding her that if she dared to leave, he could take everything, including her beloved children. He'd leave her with absolutely nothing. Then there was the infidelity. Throughout their 10-year marriage, Bob maintained a secret life that would have destroyed most relationships. He created profiles on dating apps and websites using fake identities. Sometimes he was Robert Wolfe, a divorced conservative Jew in his mid-50s. Other times he became Mike Reed, a reformed Jew in his mid-40s. The lies multiplied endlessly, each alias representing another betrayal. Stacy knew about some of the affairs. Friends confirmed she'd confronted Bob about his cheating before, but she kept trying to salvage the marriage. She'd invested everything into this relationship, this family, this life, Walking away meant admitting that the fairy tale had been a nightmare all along. By early 2015, though, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. Friends noticed Stacy's growing unhappiness. Her family sensed something was terribly wrong. The marriage was clearly disintegrating. What nobody could have predicted was just how catastrophically Bob's latest affair would end. This channel isn't just about crime. It's about remembrance, justice, and truth. Subscribe and stand with the people who never got their chance to speak. In February 2015, Bob was prowling Tinder under the name Robert Wolf. That's where he connected with Susan McBride, an unsuspecting woman who had absolutely no idea she was about to become entangled in a murder investigation spanning 7 years. Bob's deception began immediately. He told Susan he was divorced and that his ex-wife had abandoned their children, barely bothering to see them. Susan agreed to meet him, and their first date seemed genuinely promising. It was just a very easy, friendly conversation, Susan would later testify. There was no lull in the conversation that I can recall. After I left there, I remember thinking, this is a nice guy. But Susan had learned to trust her instincts. When she tried researching Bob online using the names he'd provided, she found absolutely nothing. No social media presence, no professional profiles, no digital footprint whatsoever. Something felt wrong. She attempted to end things, but Bob convinced her to give him another chance, spinning an elaborate story about being stalked, which supposedly explained his use of fake names. Against her better judgment, Susan decided to trust him one more time. On February 26, 2015, just 4 days before Stacy's death, Bob came to Susan's home for dinner. The evening ended with them sleeping together. But Bob's behavior immediately afterward triggered every alarm bell in Susan's mind. He suddenly canceled their plans for the following weekend and began emotionally withdrawing. Susan's suspicions roared back to life. And this time, she refused to be manipulated. Using every internet research skill she possessed, she finally found the truth. A listing for Stacy Feldman as PTO president at Southmore Elementary School. Bob wasn't divorced at all. He was very much married with 2 young children. Susan faced an agonizing moral dilemma. She could quietly walk away, pretending the affair had never happened. Or she could do something extraordinarily difficult. Tell Stacy the truth and face the consequences of her own involvement. Susan chose honesty. On the morning of March 1st, 2015, at exactly 6:20 a.m., Susan sent an email to Stacy Feldman that would change everything. In it, she explained that she'd met Bob on Tinder, that he'd claimed to be separated, and that she wanted Stacy to know about his infidelity. Susan attached text message exchanges with Bob as proof. What happened next would become the cornerstone of a murder case. Just before 9 a.m. that morning, Stacy called Susan. Despite having just learned about yet another devastating betrayal, Stacy remained remarkably composed during their 5-minute conversation. She was so sweet and kind, Susan would remember. She wasn't angry. Stacy revealed this wasn't Bob's first affair. He'd cheated multiple times before. But then Stacy said something that would ultimately provide prosecutors with their motive for murder. I'm done with him. 4 simple words. I'm done with him. Spoken just hours before Stacy would be found dead in her shower. Around 10 a.m., Stacy sent what would be her final text message to a friend, mentioning she was supposed to pick up the children from religious school at noon and take them to a Purim carnival. She never got that chance. March 1st, 2015 had begun like any typical Sunday morning for the Feldman family. Bob dropped their 2 children at Temple Sinai for religious school around 8:30 a.m. The plan was simple. Stacy would collect them at noon and take them to the Purim carnival at the synagogue. But when noon arrived, Stacy was nowhere to be found. The school staff tried calling her cell phone repeatedly. No answer. They called Bob to ask if someone else was collecting the children. His response was telling. He assured them he'd be there shortly. But when 12:45 p.m. came and went with no sign of Bob, the staff called again. This time, Bob claimed he thought a family friend was picking up the children, a completely different story than what he'd told them just 45 minutes earlier. Finally, at 1:05 p.m., Bob arrived. The teacher who spoke with him immediately noticed something disturbing about his demeanor. He looked disheveled and acted curtly, completely unlike his usual charming self. Instead of taking the children home to their mother, Bob spent the afternoon taking them to the Purim Carnival, then to a bicycle shop. It wasn't until approximately 3 p.m. that Bob and the children finally returned home. If you believe every victim deserves to be heard, take 1 second to subscribe, because that's how their stories stay alive long after the cameras stop rolling. His daughter would later testify that she'd been excited to show her mother the prizes she'd won at the carnival. But as they walked into the house, Bob told her to put her coat away downstairs rather than going upstairs to see Stacy. What happened next was captured in a 911 call that would be analyzed and scrutinized for years to come. "Oh my God, I need help! Please help me, please! My wife's not breathing!" Bob told the operator he'd found Stacy unconscious in their bathroom shower with water running. He claimed he'd pulled her from the tub and was attempting CPR while waiting for paramedics. But there was something fundamentally wrong with Bob's story. Something first responders noticed the instant they arrived. Despite Bob's claims that he'd pulled Stacy from a running shower, there was no water on the bathroom floor. Not a drop, not a puddle, nothing. This struck first responders as extraordinarily unusual. When you pull a body from water, there's always water everywhere. There were other glaring inconsistencies, too. During the 911 call, despite Bob's claims that he was performing CPR, the recording captured no sounds consistent with chest compressions or rescue breathing. Instead, investigators noted sounds of a toilet flushing and items being knocked over, suggesting Bob might have been staging the scene rather than trying to save his wife. When paramedics arrived at 3:40 p.m., they were unable to revive Stacy. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Detective Randy Dennison was among the first investigators to arrive. Even at this early stage, something about Bob's behavior struck him as profoundly wrong. According to the arrest affidavit, Bob appeared to be acting shocked or confused, but in a way that seemed completely performative rather than genuine. At one point, Detective Dennison wrote that Bob walked away as if he was confused, giving your affiant the impression he was overacting in an effort to avoid speaking with him. The firefighters who responded also found Bob's behavior deeply troubling. They described him as being overdramatic and purposely not cooperative. This wasn't the behavior typically seen from someone who'd just discovered their spouse's body. But at this stage, there was no obvious evidence of foul play. Stacy appeared to have died in what looked like a bathroom accident. An autopsy would be needed to determine the truth. On March 2, 2015, the day after Stacy's death, Dr. Kelly Roe Kovayansky performed the autopsy. This was significant for several reasons. Dr. Kovayansky was relatively inexperienced, with this being one of her first solo autopsies. What she found would prove both crucial and frustratingly incomplete. The autopsy revealed that Stacy had sustained more than 80 separate injuries to her body. 80 bruises, hemorrhages, abrasions, and a chipped tooth covered her body. She also had petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, tiny burst blood vessels that often indicate strangulation or suffocation. Despite these extensive injuries, Dr. Kovayansky was unable to determine exactly how Stacy had died. The cause and manner of death were officially listed as undetermined. This ruling would keep the case in limbo for years and nearly allow a killer to escape justice. Meanwhile, Bob's behavior during the initial investigation raised red flag after red flag. When questioned by police, he gave conflicting accounts of his activities on the morning of Stacy's death. Initially, He claimed he'd left for work as normal, gone to the gym, then met a colleague at a bus depot in Broomfield where part of his job involved checking advertisements on buses. But Bob's story kept changing. In a follow-up conversation, Bob told officers that Stacy had been tired and was sleeping when he left home with the children around 8:30 a.m. He claimed he returned around noon, called out to his wife but got no answer, changed clothes in the laundry room, cleaned the garage because a shelf had fallen, then went to a park and worked out. Bob also made several claims about Stacy's condition that proved to be completely false. He told police she'd consumed edibles containing marijuana the night before her death. But Stacy Feldman's autopsy report showed absolutely no signs of THC in her system. He claimed she'd been unwell for months and had even missed work for several days before her death. This also wasn't supported by any evidence. In what would later prove to be significant evidence of motive, Bob collected on Stacy's life insurance policy just months after her death. Robert Feldman received $750,000 from a policy that had been purchased 5 years earlier. Here's what's interesting. While Bob had a substantial life insurance policy on Stacy's life, there was no reciprocal policy on his own life. This asymmetry would later be viewed as evidence of premeditation. If you're still watching right now, it means you feel something. Don't let that feeling fade. Hit subscribe and help give these victims the voice they deserve. The investigation also uncovered Bob's extensive pattern of infidelity. Detectives discovered he maintained profiles on multiple dating apps and websites, constantly using fake names and conflicting personal information. One particularly disturbing incident involved a woman named Stephanie Schumacher. She'd met Bob at a grief support group where he claimed Stacy had died of cancer. Another lie. During what she believed was a date, Bob sexually assaulted her at his home. Despite all these suspicious circumstances, the undetermined ruling on Stacy's death certificate meant prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to bring murder charges. The case appeared to be at a complete dead end. But Stacy's family, particularly her sister Susan Altman, refused to accept that this was simply a tragic accident. They were convinced Bob had murdered Stacy, and they were absolutely determined to prove it. Susan Altman's instincts about her sister's death were immediate and unshakable. When her father called that March afternoon to tell her Stacy was dead, Susan's very first reaction was chilling. Her husband killed her. Susan later described that devastating phone call to the Intermountain Jewish News. She was in the Boston area, getting ready to take one of her kids to a sports game when her daughter answered the phone. "It's Grandpa," her daughter said. "Tell him I can't talk right now. We're getting ready to go," Susan replied. "No, you have to talk to him," her daughter insisted. When Susan picked up, her father's voice was on the line. "Stacy's dead." For a second, Susan couldn't even process it. "What happened?" she asked, fully expecting to hear it was a car accident. When her father told her about the supposed bathroom accident, Susan couldn't accept it. She knew her sister. She knew Bob. And something was fundamentally wrong. "My immediate reaction was that her husband had killed her," Susan told the newspaper. As months passed and the official investigation stalled, Susan took matters into her own hands. She was convinced Bob was getting away with murder, and she was absolutely determined not to let that happen. Susan's suspicions were based on years of observing Bob's behavior and the toxic dynamics of his marriage to Stacy. She'd watched as Bob systematically controlled and isolated Stacy through financial manipulation. She knew about his history of infidelity and his threats to take the children if Stacy tried to leave. Susan described Bob as a chronically underperforming salesman who was always looking for a free buck. She even recalled how he'd bring broken suitcases to airports, then claim they were damaged during travel and demand airlines replace them with nicer models. A small-scale scam that revealed his fundamentally dishonest character. But Susan knew her suspicions alone wouldn't be enough to bring Bob to justice. She needed evidence, expertise, and allies in her fight for truth. The breakthrough came nearly 2 years after Stacy's death during a conversation with a psychologist relative. As Susan described the circumstances of Stacy's death and the dynamics of her marriage to Bob, the psychologist made an observation that changed everything. It sounds like an abusive relationship that escalated to murder. The psychologist suggested Susan contact the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, an organization specializing in identifying and investigating cases where domestic violence has escalated to lethal force, particularly in cases that might appear to be accidents or suicides. Susan immediately reached out. They connected her with Detective Randy Dennison, who had been the lead investigator on Stacy's case from the beginning. Detective Dennison had always harbored suspicions about the case, but lacked the specialized expertise to prove his theories. The Institute connected them with Dr. Bill Smock, a forensic pathologist and expert in domestic violence strangulation. Dr. Smock was a seasoned emergency room physician with a fellowship in forensics who had participated in thousands of autopsies and crime scene evaluations. He'd worked on some extraordinarily high-profile cases, including serving as a key expert witness in the Derek Chauvin trial for George Floyd's murder and the Kendi Howard case, where he helped prove that a former Idaho State Police trooper had strangled his wife and staged her death as a suicide. You've listened to Stacy's story, and if you still don't feel the need to subscribe, tell us why in the comments. We really want to understand. Dr. Smock had achieved a 100% conviction rate in strangulation cases where his living forensics techniques were used. Susan's persistence had finally connected the case with someone who had the specialized knowledge to recognize what had really happened to Stacy. Meanwhile, another crucial piece of the puzzle was falling into place. In June 2015, about 3 months after Stacy's death, Susan McBride was having another disappointing online dating experience. It reminded her of her encounter with Bob Feldman, and she began wondering what had happened with his marriage situation. Susan decided to do an internet search to see if Bob and Stacy had gotten divorced as he'd claimed they would. Instead of finding divorce records, she found something that made her physically ill. Stacy Feldman's obituary, dated March 1st, 2015, the exact same day Susan had told her about the affair. "I got physically ill," Susan later recalled. "I knew immediately when I saw the date that that was the reason she was dead." Susan immediately contacted the Denver Police Department and shared her story with Detective Dennison. She told him about her affair with Bob, about how she'd discovered his lies, and about the phone conversation she'd had with Stacy on the morning of her death. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough Susan Altman had been praying for. Finally, there was evidence of motive. Bob had killed Stacy because she'd discovered his affair and told him she was done. But it would still take the expertise of Dr. Smock to prove that Stacy's death was actually murder. When Dr. Bill Smock agreed to review the Stacy Feldman case in 2017, nearly 3 years after her death, he brought with him decades of experience in identifying concealed homicides. As an expert in domestic violence strangulation cases, Dr. Smock knew exactly what to look for when examining cases where murder had been staged to look like accidents. Dr. Smock spent months meticulously reviewing every aspect of the case: the autopsy report, toxicology tests, and hundreds of photographs taken at the scene and during the autopsy. What he found painted an absolutely horrifying picture of Stacy's final moments. The more than 80 injuries on Stacy's body told a story the original pathologist had completely missed. Dr. Smock determined these weren't injuries from a slip and fall in the shower. They weren't from CPR attempts or being pulled from a bathtub. They were injuries consistent with a violent, prolonged assault. "It's my opinion she died from suffocation, strangulation, or a combination of both," Dr. Smock testified. He believed Stacy had been attacked by someone who straddled her, using their knees to pin down her upper arms while they choked and suffocated her. The evidence for this theory was overwhelming. Stacy had defensive wounds on the backs of her hands, showing she'd fought desperately for her life. The pattern of bruising on her upper arms was consistent with someone's knees pressing down on her. The petechial hemorrhages in her eyes were classic signs of strangulation. Perhaps most tellingly, Dr. Smock found evidence that Stacy had been clothed when the attack began. There were imprints of fabric pressed into her skin, indicating she was fully dressed when she was being assaulted. This completely contradicted Bob's story that she died while showering. Dr. Smock also examined crime scene photographs and found additional evidence the scene had been staged. Stacy was found with a dress watch on her left wrist, highly unusual for someone supposedly showering. There was no water on the bathroom floor despite claims Stacy had been pulled from a running shower. Some bottles in the shower had been knocked over, suggesting a struggle. But other bottles that should have fallen during such an event remained perfectly in place. Most damning of all, there was no bruising around the imprint of a metal shelf that had supposedly fallen on Stacy's body. This indicated she was already dead when she came into contact with the shelf. Proof she'd been placed in the shower after death. We tell these stories so they're not forgotten. If you won't subscribe, tell us what's holding you back. Maybe your words can help us do better. Dr. Smock's analysis painted a crystal clear picture. Bob had attacked Stacy in their bedroom, strangling and suffocating her during a vicious assault. He'd then undressed her body and staged the scene in the shower to make it look like an accident. The attack itself would have been absolutely terrifying for Stacy. Dr. Smock believed Bob could have rendered her unconscious in as little as 5 to 10 seconds by applying pressure to her neck, and that she would have stopped breathing within 1 to 2.5 minutes. When asked if Stacy had suffered before she died, Dr. Smock replied simply, "Yes, ma'am." The injuries Dr. Smock identified were described as constellations of injuries that were absolutely not consistent with removal from a bathtub or resuscitation attempts. Instead, they showed evidence of what he called a vicious beatdown. Based on Dr. Smock's expert analysis, the Denver District Attorney's Office finally had what they needed to prosecute Bob Feldman for murder. His report provided the crucial evidence that transformed an undetermined death into a homicide case. On February 16, 2018, nearly 3 years after Stacy's death, Bob Feldman was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Robert Feldman's arrest in February 2018 should have marked the beginning of the end. Instead, it marked the beginning of another frustrating chapter filled with delays and legal maneuvering. Bob was initially held without bail, but after a preliminary hearing, he was allowed to post a $1 million bond and placed on house arrest. The defense argued the prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. But before the case could go to trial, it became mired in delays. The COVID-19 pandemic forced repeated postponements with key witnesses unable to travel. During this time, Bob remained at home, but was caught regularly leaving for unauthorized bicycle rides throughout Denver, even posting the routes online despite being on strict house arrest. There was also a legal battle over Bob's use of Stacy's life insurance money. In 2019, the Colorado Supreme Court ruled that Bob could use $550,000 of the $750,000 payout to hire his criminal defense attorneys. "This man has taken 7 years from my life," Susan would later say. 7 years of me being able to live. 7 years of being able to be a mother to my children. Finally, in early 2022, nearly 7 years after Stacy's death, Robert Feldman would face a jury for her murder. Robert Feldman's trial finally began in April 2022. Judge Edward Bronfin presided over the 9-day trial that captivated public attention. The prosecution's star witness was Dr. Bill Smock, who used a mannequin to demonstrate how Bob had attacked Stacy, straddling her and using his knees to pin down her arms while he strangled her. Prosecutor Maggie Conboy told the jury, "Stacy Feldman can't tell you what happened that day, but her body can. And what it tells you is that she suffered a long, protracted, and horrific beating." Susan McBride flew in from Italy to testify about her phone call with Stacy on the morning of her death. Most poignant was the testimony of the Feldman's daughter, now 16 years old, who said the morning seemed completely normal. "I remember walking downstairs and having breakfast with my family. There was talking, Nothing seemed unusual. The defense attacked Dr. Smock's credentials. Defense attorney Jeffrey Pagliuca called him a hired gun and a narcissist, arguing that 3 pathologists maintained Stacy's death was undetermined. "We can't accept gossip and rumor instead of truth," Pagliuca said. "This is a tragedy, not a homicide." Throughout the trial, Bob sat quietly, showing little emotion, occasionally laughing with his lawyers, while testimony about his wife's brutal murder was being presented. After 9 days, the case went to the jury. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Robert Feldman was guilty of first-degree murder. We tell these stories to expose monsters. Support us by hitting the subscribe button. If this story didn't move you to subscribe, comment below and tell us why. Because silence only helps the next monster hide. Stacy Feldman's mother, Dorothy Malman, addressed Bob directly. "If you really loved your children, you wouldn't have killed their mother. This is all because you couldn't keep your pants zipped and agreed to the divorce Stacy wanted. You are evil." Susan Altman said, "I have been fighting for this for 7 years because my sister deserves to rest in peace. This man has taken 7 years from my life, and he's not taking 1 more second." When asked if he wanted to make a statement, Bob simply replied, "No." He offered no apology, no explanation, no remorse. Bob Feldman refused to accept responsibility and immediately began appeals, challenging various aspects of the trial. In November 2024, the Colorado Court of Appeals issued a 51-page decision rejecting all challenges. The 3-judge panel unanimously affirmed his conviction. Bob's primary argument was that Dr. Smock's testimony had usurped the county coroner's authority. The court firmly rejected this, ruling that an undetermined cause of death does not preclude prosecutors from presenting expert testimony. He was also ordered to pay $111,600 for his children's therapy costs. A fund was created in Stacy's memory to provide legal assistance to domestic violence survivors. Susan became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, working with the Alliance for Hope International. The conviction of Robert Feldman was ultimately the result of what prosecutors and media called the sisterhood, a group of women who refused to let Stacy's killer escape justice. At the center was Susan Altman, whose relentless pursuit of justice drove the case forward when official investigations stalled. Susan McBride's courage in coming forward provided crucial evidence about motive and timeline. And without Dr. Smock's specialized knowledge of strangulation patterns and staged crime scenes, Bob might never have been charged with murder. Stacy Feldman will be remembered not just as a victim, but as a beloved mother, sister, and community member whose death led to important changes in how we investigate domestic violence cases. In the end, love proved stronger than evil. A sister's determination prevailed over a killer's deception. Stacy Feldman can finally rest in peace, knowing that justice has been served. "She was just a ray of sunshine," Susan said. "She had these beautiful blue eyes. They just sparkled. You could see into her soul." If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden dangers of domestic violence and the importance of never giving up on justice, I need you to do something right now. Smash that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Stacy's story. And if you haven't already subscribed to Cold Crime Cases, what are you waiting for? We're building a community dedicated to giving voice to victims and celebrating those who fight for truth. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought about this case. Did Susan Altman's determination inspire you? Are you shocked it took 7 years to bring Bob to justice? I read every single comment, and I want to hear from you. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied.